They didn't want him dead. That was the part that made it worse. When the bosun stepped forward with the cord and the stick, every man on deck already knew what was coming. They'd seen it before. They'd remember it for the rest of their lives, which, on a ship like this, might not be long. The condemned man knew it too. He knew exactly what the next 20 minutes would feel like, because he'd watched it happen to someone else. That was the point. That was always the point. The punishment wasn't designed to end him. It was designed to change him. To reach inside whatever part of a man generates defiance and quietly dismantle it, leaving the body functional, the labor available, the obedience permanent. Pirates had discovered something that armies and empires and legal systems were still fumbling toward. Killing a disobedient man solves one problem and creates 3 more. It removes the labor. It martyrs the offender in the eyes of wavering crew members, and it signals to everyone watching that the captain's only tool is the final one, which means the moment the crew stops fearing death, the captain has nothing left. But a man who survives a punishment he never wants to experience again, that man rows the boat. That man stands the watch. That man makes a calculation every single morning and decides, without being asked, that compliance costs less than resistance. This is the psychology that pirate captains, most of them uneducated, all of them operating by instinct and hard experience, had stumbled into. And it was more sophisticated than almost anything being theorized in the universities of Europe at the same time. Let's go inside it. Start with a question that historians of piracy almost never ask. Why did pirate punishments work on this particular population of men? Because the population matters. These were not ordinary sailors. The men who joined pirate crews in the Golden Age, roughly 1650 to 1730, were, as a group, the most psychologically hardened maritime workforce in the world. Most had served in the Royal Navy, where flogging was routine, where pressed men were held by force, where officers held the power of life and death with minimal oversight. Many had served on merchant vessels under conditions that modern historians describe as barely distinguishable from slavery. These were men who had been beaten before, men who had watched beatings before, men who had survived conditions that would break the average person on land. And yet the pirate punishment system controlled them. That demands an explanation. You cannot explain it through severity alone. The Royal Navy was equally severe and produced chronic desertion, mutiny, and resistance at every level. Something about the pirate system was different. Something made it work on men who had already proven they could withstand conventional punishment. The answer, reconstructed from trial records, survivor accounts, and the Admiralty documents that historians have been combing through for 3 centuries, comes down to 3 psychological mechanisms that operated simultaneously: certainty, witness, and what modern psychologists would recognize as identity investment. Each one deserves its own examination. The first mechanism was certainty, not severity. Certainty. This distinction is one of the most important and least understood principles in the psychology of deterrence, and pirates arrived at it empirically before any theorist wrote it down. The question is never how bad the punishment is. The question is how reliably it follows the offense. A man calculating whether to steal from a crewmate does not primarily think about what the punishment feels like. He thinks about the probability of getting caught and the probability that the punishment will actually be carried out. If he believes there is a realistic chance of escaping consequence, through favoritism, through the captain's mood, through the chaos of daily shipboard life, the calculation shifts. The punishment stops being a deterrent and becomes a risk assessment. Pirate articles eliminated this calculation. The punishments were written down, agreed upon in advance, applied by the quartermaster, not by the captain, which removed the variable of personal favoritism entirely. When Bartholomew Roberts' articles specified marooning for theft from a crewmate, that outcome was not subject to negotiation or to the captain's temper on a given morning. The quartermaster confirmed the offense, the crew voted if required, and the punishment followed with mechanical inevitability. This mechanical quality, the sense that the system operated independently of any individual's mercy or cruelty, was psychologically devastating in a specific way. There was no one to appeal to, no relationship to leverage, no argument to make. The articles were not a person. You could not charm them or intimidate them or wait until they were in a better mood. You had signed a document, and the document was now executing itself. Behavioral psychologists studying compliance and deterrence have found consistently that predictability of consequence produces more reliable behavioral change than severity of consequence. A certain mild punishment changes behavior more durably than an unpredictable severe one. The pirates, working from pure empirical experience with no theoretical framework, had built a system optimized for certainty. Every man aboard knew exactly what would happen if he crossed a specific line. The knowledge alone shifted behavior before any punishment was ever administered. The second mechanism was witness, and this is where the pirate system revealed its deepest sophistication. Every punishment was public, non-negotiably, structurally, always public. The ship's bell rang, the crew assembled. No one was excused, and this was not incidental. It was the entire point of the exercise. Here is what modern neuroscience tells us about witnessed punishment, reconstructed into terms that apply to the pirate context. When a human being watches another person experience pain or distress, specific neural systems activate that partially simulate that experience in the observer, not at full intensity. But the body of the witness does not remain entirely passive. Heart rate changes, stress hormones shift. The memory of the event is encoded differently than the memory of a neutral observation, because the brain tags it with emotional significance. This means that every man who stood on deck and watched a punishment did not just acquire information about what the punishment was. He acquired a partial physical memory of what the punishment felt like. The distinction is crucial. Information can be forgotten, discounted, rationalized away. Physical memory is harder to dismiss. When that crew member later considered breaking the articles, he was not consulting an abstract fact about consequences. He was consulting a somatic memory stored in his own nervous system. The pirates had inadvertently built a punishment system that bypassed the rational calculation entirely and went straight to the body. There is a further layer. The requirement that every man watch meant that no one could claim ignorance and no one could claim distance. Every man was a witness, which made every man complicit in the enforcement of the code. This collective witnessing created a specific psychological condition. The crew became, in a functional sense, the enforcement mechanism of its own discipline, not the captain, not the quartermaster. The crew itself, by watching and not intervening, ratified each punishment. The system reproduced itself through the bodies of the men it controlled. Charles Johnson, writing in 1724 from interviews with men who had served on pirate vessels, noted something that seems like a minor observation but carries significant weight. He recorded that experienced pirate crews had a particular quality of silence during punishments, not the silence of passivity. A different quality, attentive, almost ritualized. Men who had seen dozens of punishments still watched with full attention, as if the watching itself was understood to be a duty. That attentiveness was not accidental. It was the system working exactly as designed. The third mechanism is the most psychologically complex and the most important for understanding why the pirate system worked on men that conventional naval discipline had failed to break. Identity investment. When a man joins a pirate crew and signs the articles, something happens that does not happen when a man is pressed into the Royal Navy or hired onto a merchant vessel under economic duress. He makes a choice, a genuine, deliberate, fully informed choice. He reads the articles, or has them read to him. He understands the terms, he understands the punishments, and he signs. That act of voluntary agreement does something to the human mind that coerced agreement cannot replicate. It creates ownership. The man who signs the articles has not merely accepted terms of employment. He has invested his identity in a system. The articles are now, in a psychological sense, partly his. He helped create them through his agreement. He is a stakeholder in their enforcement. This is why the punishment for violating the articles carried a psychological weight that went far beyond the physical experience. A man flogged by a Royal Navy officer had been hurt by an external authority that he resented and did not recognize as legitimate. A man flogged under the articles he had signed had been punished by a system he had chosen. The difference in how that punishment was processed internally was enormous. Survivors of pirate discipline, men who gave testimony during admiralty trials and whose accounts historians have analyzed, consistently describe their experience in terms that reflect this dynamic. They rarely express the pure resentment toward the punishment system that former Royal Navy men expressed toward naval discipline. They more often describe something closer to shame, an acknowledgement that they had violated a compact they believed in. The punishment, in their own words, felt deserved in a way that naval flogging never did. Shame-based compliance is extraordinarily durable. Resentment-based compliance evaporates the moment the external authority is removed or weakened. A man who complies because he resents the consequences will defect the first moment the consequences seem uncertain. A man who complies because he is invested in the system that prescribes the consequences, because he has signed the document, because he helped choose the captain, because he receives his guaranteed share of the plunder, has internal reasons for compliance that persist independently of any external threat. This is what the pirate discipline system built, not obedience through fear alone, obedience through ownership of the system that demanded it. Now here is where it gets considerably darker, because the pirates also understood, not theoretically but practically, viscerally, that identity investment alone was not enough, that certainty and witness were not enough, that there had to be, underneath all of it, a genuine capacity for horror, a floor of brutality that every man knew existed and that made the entire structure credible. Edward Lowe is the key figure here. Lowe is important not because he was the most successful pirate, he wasn't, but because he represents the point at which the pirate discipline system became something else entirely, something that even other pirates found uncomfortable. Lowe's punishments went beyond calibration. He administered the wooding, the tourniquet cord twisted around the skull, not as a defined consequence for a specific offense, but at his own discretion, for offenses he invented in the moment. He burned men, he cut them, he developed what his own crew members later described in testimony as an almost experimental curiosity about how much a man could endure while remaining functional. And his ships were disasters, chronic near mutiny, crew members defecting to other vessels at every opportunity, loyalty that lasted only as long as no better option appeared. Lowe is the proof case for everything the effective pirate system was designed to avoid. When punishment becomes arbitrary, when it detaches from the articles, from the written code, from the collective agreement, it loses its psychological function entirely. It no longer deters because it no longer has predictability. A man cannot calculate the cost of defiance if the punishment for defiance changes based on the captain's mood that morning. Arbitrary punishment does something worse than arbitrary punishment fails to deter. It actively produces resistance, because arbitrary punishment signals to every crew member that the system is not a system at all. It is simply one man's will, imposed by force, and a man who is being controlled by pure force, with no legitimate framework around it, has no psychological investment in compliance. He is not a stakeholder. He is a prisoner, and prisoners plan escapes. The contrast between Roberts and Lowe, the most successful pirate of the era and the most feared in the worst sense of that word, is the clearest evidence we have for what the pirate discipline system was actually doing. Roberts's ships ran with cohesion. His crews stayed. His punishments were severe but predictable, applied within a framework his men had agreed to, witnessed by men who were invested in the system that delivered them. Lowe's ships ran on terror. His crews defected when they could and endured when they couldn't. His punishments were severe and unpredictable, applied outside any framework, witnessed by men who felt no ownership of the system that produced them. Same ocean, same era, completely different psychological architectures. There is a final layer to this that almost never appears in histories of piracy, Because it requires taking seriously something that seems contradictory on its face. The men who designed and lived within the pirate punishment system were not sadists. Some individual captains were, low most obviously, but the system itself, the articles and the quartermasters and the public rituals, was not designed by men who enjoyed inflicting pain. It was designed by men who were terrified of chaos, terrified of what happened to a ship where no one followed any rules. They had seen it, most of them, on naval vessels or merchant ships where authority had collapsed. They knew what it looked like when armed men with nothing to lose and no framework of accountability turned on each other. They had watched it. Some of them had survived it. The pirate discipline system was not the expression of power. It was the expression of fear about what happened when power failed. Every lash, every cobbing, every wooding, every public ritual of witnessed punishment, it was all, at its foundation, an attempt by desperate men to hold something together in the most difficult environment human beings had yet devised for destroying cohesion. They built a system of terror because they were afraid. And the terrible irony, the thing that makes the pirate codes genuinely tragic rather than simply brutal, is that it worked. Not perfectly, not always, but often enough, durably enough, that men who had never experienced anything resembling justice in their entire lives found something on those ships that functioned like it. A code that applied to everyone, a punishment that followed every offense, a share of the plunder that arrived by formula, not by favor. They controlled men without killing them, because killing them would have meant the end of the only system those men had ever chosen to live inside. And somewhere, underneath the violence and the fear and the articles signed in blood, that mattered.